The morning Jennie Brenner rode onto Nathan Hale's land with a surveyor's map rolled under her arm and murder in her eyes. The sun was barely 3 fingers above the Wyoming horizon, and the whole world smelled like sage and impending argument. She had been riding since before dawn, pushing her roan mare across the high plateau country northwest of Laramie, following the creek line that her late father's deed described as the southern boundary of Brenner Range. Her father, Thomas Brenner, had died 14 months ago in the autumn of 1882, leaving her the deed, the cattle, 2 aging ranch hands named Cord and Elijah, and a dispute with the neighboring Hale operation that had been simmering like a badly tended pot of beans since before she could remember. She was 26 years old. She had managed the ranch alone through a brutal Wyoming winter, and she was not in the mood to be reasonable. She was in the mood to win. The creek was called Sorrow Creek, which she had always thought was apt, because it had caused her family nothing but grief. The question was simple, at least in her mind. The grazing line between Brenner land and Hale land ran along the east bank of Sorrow Creek. Her father's deed said East Bank. Nathan Hale's deed, she had been told by her ranch hand Cord, said the center of the creek. That difference of perhaps 30 yards of riparian grass and water access amounted, over the length of the boundary, to something like 400 acres of prime summer grazing, and she intended to claim every square foot of it. She found Nathan Hale where she had not expected to find him, which was not at his ranch house but standing knee-deep in the creek itself, his boots left on the bank, his trousers rolled to the knee, holding a surveyor's chain and arguing quietly with a young man she did not recognize. Both of them were so absorbed in their conversation that they did not hear her approach until her mare's hooves clattered on the loose shale of the bank. He looked up, and Jennie Brenner got her first real look at Nathan Hale. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone in the Laramie Basin had heard of Nathan Hale. He had come to Wyoming from Pennsylvania 6 years ago, in 1877, when she had still been helping her father count cattle and mend fence. He was 31 now, she knew, which put 5 years between them, and he had built his operation from a modest homestead claim into one of the more productive ranches in the county through what everyone agreed was relentless hard work, fair dealing, and an almost irritating refusal to cut corners. He was tall, with dark hair that the creek wind was currently making a mess of, and he had the kind of lean, weathered face that came from spending years outdoors without much concern for appearances. He was not what she would call handsome in any conventional sense. He was something more complicated than that. His eyes, she noticed even from the bank, were very dark and very direct. He looked at her without alarm, which already annoyed her. Most men, when confronted by a woman riding alone onto their land at dawn with a rolled map and a set jaw, had the decency to look at least slightly unsettled. "Miss Brenner," he said. His voice was even, not unfriendly, simply calm in the way that a man who had learned to think before speaking was often calm. "I figured someone from your operation would be coming around eventually." "Then you figured correctly," Jennie said. She swung down from the saddle with practiced ease and tied her mare to a nearby cottonwood. She pulled the surveyor's map from under her arm and crossed the shale to the water's edge. "I have my father's deed and the original survey from 1874. The grazing line between Brenner Range and Hale Range runs along the east bank of this creek. I want your cattle off my grass." The young man with the chain glanced nervously between them. Nathan Hale looked at Jennie for a moment, then nodded once toward the bank. "Step back, Pete," he said. The young man waded out with visible relief. Nathan Hale followed him, retrieved his boots from the bank, and sat down on a flat rock to pull them on. He was taking his time about it, which was the sort of thing that drove Jennie absolutely to distraction. "I have the 1874 survey as well," he said, tugging at his left boot, "and the deed my operation purchased in 1877 from the original homestead claim. My deed reads center of Sorrow Creek as the boundary." "Your deed is wrong." "My deed might be wrong," he said, and Jennie blinked because she had not expected that. "But so might yours." That's the thing about conflicting legal descriptions in a territory where half the original surveys were done by men who had been drinking since noon. Both of us might have a legitimate claim, or neither of us might. Or one of us is right. I've been out here trying to sort out which one it is. Jennie studied him. You were surveying your own boundary. Been at it 3 mornings this week. He stood, stamped his boots into place, and took the map she was holding before she quite realized she was handing it to him. He spread it on the flat rock, weighing the corners with stones from the creek bank, and bent to study it. He was quiet for a long moment. Your 1874 survey marks the line at the east bank, he said. Mine marks it at Center Channel. He looked up at her. Do you have the original field notes from the 1874 survey? She did not, but she was not going to admit that immediately. I have the deed. The deed references the survey. The survey field notes would tell us where the surveyor actually ran his chain. He straightened and looked at the creek. The creek has moved, Miss Brenner. That's part of the problem. Sorrow Creek's channel has shifted about 15 yards east in the past decade. I've been measuring against some old cottonwood stumps that were on the bank in 1874, according to the field notes I found in the county recorder's office last month. Jennie stared at him. You went to the county recorder's office. 3 weeks ago, yes, in Laramie. He folded his hands behind his back and looked at the map again. I found the 1874 field notes, but they're incomplete. The surveyor, a man named Hobbs, ran his chain from the north end of the boundary south to a point he marked as a blaze on a cottonwood. Below that point the notes are missing, torn pages possibly, which means we can only definitively establish the boundary for the northern third of the shared line. The southern 2/3, where your cattle and mine have been overlapping, is genuinely uncertain. Jennie stood very still in the morning wind. She had come here prepared for several versions of this conversation. She had been prepared for denial. She had been prepared for aggression, for bluster, for the kind of posturing that men who felt cornered by women sometimes produced. She had not been prepared for this quiet, methodical, almost apologetic presentation of complexity. You're telling me, she said carefully, that you don't know if your cattle have been on my land. I'm telling you I don't know if the land in question is your land or mine, and I'm not willing to claim otherwise just because it's inconvenient to be uncertain. He looked at her directly. I'm also not willing to simply move my cattle off range that might legally be mine just because you've ridden out here with a rolled-up map and a very determined expression. There was nothing insulting in how he said it. It was simply a statement of fact. Jennie, who had been marshalling arguments all the way across the plateau, found herself suddenly without the particular argument she had planned to make, because he had already made part of it himself and complicated the rest. What do you suggest? She said, and hated how reasonable she sounded. Come up to the house, he said. I have the field notes and you have your father's deed. If we lay them out together, we might be able to figure out where the actual line is. I also have coffee, which I suspect we both need before 9 in the morning. He glanced at the sky, then back at her. There's no reason this has to be a fight. Not yet, anyway. Jennie Brenner had not gotten through 14 months of running a cattle operation alone by being inflexible. She could recognize a genuinely good offer when she heard one, even if she wished it had not come from someone who was standing between her and 400 acres of grass. All right, she said. I will look at your field notes. He nodded, called to Pete to finish staking the south end of the chain run, and walked up the bank toward his horse with the easy, unhurried stride of a man entirely comfortable in his own landscape. Jennie untied her mare and followed, and told herself firmly that she was not paying any particular attention to the way he moved. The Hale ranch house was a solid, unshowy structure of pine logs and cut stone, set on a gentle rise above the creek valley with a view of the mountains to the west that was, Jennie had to admit privately, magnificent. There was a barn to the east, a bunkhouse beyond that, and a kitchen garden on the south side of the house that was doing better than her own kitchen garden, which she found mildly irritating. The whole place had the look of somewhere that was cared for, not just worked. Nathan Hale led her inside without ceremony. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and apparent office all at once, with a long pine table that held both a coffee pot on a trivet and an impressive spread of papers, maps, and what looked like several government land office publications. A black iron stove stood against the north wall. The room smelled of pine resin, old paper, and very good coffee. He went directly to the stove, checked the coffee pot, and poured 2 cups. He handed her one before she had even unsaddled her position at the table, and Jennie wrapped both hands around the tin cup and drank. The coffee was exceptional. She did not say so. Nathan Hale spread the county recorder's field notes beside her deed on the table, and they bent over the papers together in the morning light. He pointed out the surveyor Hobbs's notations for the northern section, explained where the pages ended, showed her his own measurements from the preceding days. He was methodical and clear, never condescending, never dismissive, never trying to hurry her through the parts that were complicated. When she pointed out something he had not considered, he looked at it seriously and said, "That's a fair point. I hadn't accounted for that." No man in Jennie Brenner's experience had ever said those words to her quite so naturally. They worked through the morning, refilling their coffee cups twice. Jennie had expected this to take an hour at most. Instead, she found herself still at the table 2 hours later, and the conversation had shifted without her fully noticing from the specific question of the grazing line to the broader question of why the 1874 survey had been done so poorly in the first place. Hobbs was employed by the territorial government, Nathan said, tracing a line on the map with his finger. But the territorial government in 1874 was not exactly flush with funds or careful about who they hired. There are at least a dozen disputed boundaries in this county alone that trace back to that same survey party. My father spent 20 years fighting over this line, Jennie said. She had not meant to say it. It came out with more feeling than she intended, and she heard it too late to take it back. Nathan Hale looked at her, not with pity, which she would have hated, but with something more careful than that. "I know," he said. "My father fought with your father over it too before he died. He always said Thomas Brenner was a stubborn man. He was. My father was equally stubborn for what it's worth." Jennie looked at the field notes. "And now they're both dead, and we're still arguing over a creek that's moved 15 yards from where it was when the argument started." "When you put it that way," Nathan said, "it sounds almost like something ought to be done differently." The way he said it, quiet and without pressure, made Jennie look up. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was attentive and honest and slightly wry, the expression of a man who understood the absurdity of a situation without being contemptuous of the people caught in it. She drank her coffee. She looked at the map. "If we hire a proper surveyor," she said slowly, "a competent one, not a government employee who drinks, and we survey the whole line from the northern boundary stake to the south, we'll have an answer that can't be disputed." "That's what I've been thinking for the past month," Nathan said. "It will cost money." "We split it," he said immediately. 50-50. Whatever the survey costs, we each pay half." Jennie studied him. "And if the line comes out in my favor, then I move my cattle and we establish a new fence line," he said without hesitation. "And if it comes out in your favor, then you move yours and I replace the fence." He met her eyes steadily. "I want to know where the real line is, Miss Brenner. I don't want to be grazing on your land if it's your land. And I don't want to give up land that's mine because the argument has been going on long enough that it feels easier to capitulate. I want to know the truth of it and settle it properly." Jennie Brenner had grown up around cattle men. She knew how to read them the way she knew how to read weather coming off the mountains, through a combination of experience and something deeper than logic. She looked at Nathan Hale and she saw a man who meant every word he had just said. It was, she thought, the most disarming thing anyone had done to her in years. "All right," she said. "We hire a surveyor and split the cost. I know a man in Laramie who worked on the Union Pacific Survey. He's supposed to be competent." "George Alderman," Nathan said. "I've heard the same." "Then we agree." "We agree. He extended his hand across the table, and Jennie shook it, and the handshake was firm and brief and entirely businesslike, and she was aware of the warmth of his hand in the cool morning air, and she released it quickly and looked back at the map. "I'll send word to Alderman," she said. "Can I take the field notes to copy them? I'll have them back to you inside a week." "Keep them as long as you need," Nathan said. "I can ride over and collect them." "You don't need to ride over. I'll bring them back." She rolled the field notes carefully and tucked them under her arm beside her own map. She finished her coffee and set the cup on the table and moved toward the door, and something made her pause at the threshold. "The coffee was very good," she said, and then felt heat in her face that she was glad he could not see because she was looking at the door. "There's good coffee every morning," Nathan Hale said, and his voice was absolutely neutral, but when she glanced back, he was looking at her with an expression that was not quite neutral at all. She rode home across the plateau in the late morning sun and spent most of the ride arguing with herself about why she felt better than she had in months. Cord was waiting at the Brenner ranch when she arrived, sitting on the porch steps with his hat on his knee and the expression of a man who expected news. He was 53, grizzled, had worked for her father since before she was born, and was constitutionally incapable of pretending he was not curious about things. "Well," he said. "He's not a thief," Jennie said, dismounting. "The situation is genuinely complicated. We're hiring a surveyor." Cord chewed on that for a moment. "Hale agreed to a surveyor." "He suggested it before I did, more or less." "Huh." Cord stood and took her mare's reins. "Your father always said old Ezra Hale would steal the shoes off a dead man if he could get away with it." "Ezra Hale is dead," Jennie said. "His son is not his father." She said it more firmly than she had intended, and Cord gave her a look she did not care for. She went inside to copy the field notes before she said anything else she was not prepared to examine. The surveyor, George Alderman, was available 3 weeks hence, which gave Jennie Brenner 3 weeks of ordinary ranch work and too much time to think. She rode her fence lines, counted cattle, directed Cord and Elijah through the repair of the north barn's south wall, which had been threatening to give way since January, and she thought about Nathan Hale's coffee and his direct dark eyes and the way he had said, simply and without drama, that he wanted to know the truth of it. She had been to Laramie twice in those 3 weeks for supplies, and had seen him once at the general store, where they had exchanged a nod that was somehow warmer than a nod usually was, and then gone about their separate business, and she had thought about that nod for longer than was entirely dignified. On the 4th day of the 2nd week, he rode to her ranch. He came in the middle of the afternoon, and she was in the kitchen garden pulling weeds, which was not how she would have chosen to be found, but she heard the hooves and stood and shaded her eyes and felt something small and warm happen in her chest when she recognized him. He dismounted at the fence and came to the gate with his hat in his hand, which she appreciated. "I was in the area," he said, "checking the fence line on the north pasture. Thought I'd see how you were getting on." "Getting on fine," Jennie said. She dusted her hands on her apron. "Do you want to come in for coffee?" The words were out before she had fully decided to say them, but she did not take them back. He smiled then for the first time she had seen, and it was a small smile, almost careful, as if he had not expected the invitation and was not going to make too much of it. "I'd appreciate that," he said. She made coffee on the kitchen stove while Nathan sat at her table and looked at the copy she had made of the field notes, and they talked about the survey, and then about the spring grass, and then about the trouble with beef prices in 1883, and what the railroad shipping rates were likely to do by fall. He knew the market well, better than she had expected, and he had opinions about it that were measured and well-reasoned, and she found herself saying things she had not said aloud to anyone since her father died. Observations about the range and the cattle and the slow grinding difficulty of running an operation without quite enough hands and too much uncertainty about the future. He listened the way some people read, with his whole attention directed at the words and the spaces between them. When she refilled his cup, he said, "Your father did well by this place. even with the boundary trouble. He spent his whole life on it, Jennie said. She sat down across from him. He had this idea that if he worked hard enough, long enough, the land would be properly his in some way that went beyond what was written on the deed. Like ownership wasn't just legal, it was something you earned through sweat. I understand that idea, Nathan said. My father felt similarly. He looked at his cup. But your father didn't have sons, and mine had one, and yet somehow I think you've been more suited to this work than I am. Jennie looked at him sharply, because men did not often say things like that, and when they did, it was usually not quite what they meant. I mean it plainly, he said, meeting her look. You rode out to dispute that boundary line alone at dawn with your documents in order and your argument prepared. I've been working up to that conversation for 3 weeks. You got there first. Jennie studied him for a long moment. You're not going to tell me it's unusual for a woman to be running a ranch. It's unusual, he said. But unusual and wrong aren't the same thing, and I've never been confused about which is which. He said it simply, without performance, and went back to his coffee, and Jennie sat with that for a moment and felt something in her chest that had been drawn tight for a long time ease just slightly. They talked until the sun dropped toward the peaks, and then Nathan Hale stood and thanked her for the coffee and rode home, and Jennie stood on her porch and watched him go and had the very clear, very inconvenient thought that she wanted him to come back. The survey happened on a Tuesday in late May, the air sharp and bright, with the mountains still carrying their white at the peaks and the creek running full with snowmelt. George Alderman was a methodical man in his 40s, with a beard he kept very neatly trimmed, and the quiet, self-contained manner of someone who spent most of his professional life in the middle of other people's arguments, and had learned to stay out of them. He brought a rodman and ran his chain with careful attention for 2 full days along the Brenner-Hale boundary line, working from the northern stake south to the creek's end at the pasture boundary. Jennie and Nathan both rode the survey with him, which meant 2 days of riding the same ground in close company, which Jennie had not fully planned for. She had planned for a professional event with a clear outcome. She had not planned for Nathan Hale to be good company, or for him to know the names of the birds that moved through the riparian willows along the creek, or for him to stop his horse at the top of a rocky rise in the late afternoon of the first day and look out across the valley and say, quietly and without any particular intention, "This is the best country I've ever seen." It was the best country Jennie had ever seen too, and she had grown up in it. But hearing him say it made her see it differently. The way hearing a word said aloud makes you realize you've only ever encountered it in print. On the second evening, after Alderman and his rodman had gone back toward town, Nathan built a small fire on the bank of Sorrow Creek and boiled water for coffee in a tin pot he had brought in his saddlebag, and they sat on the bank in the long golden light of a Wyoming evening and waited for Alderman's findings, which the surveyor had promised by end of week. "What if it goes against you?" Jennie said. She was watching the fire. Nathan poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it across to her. "Then my cattle have been on your grass and I owe you for that. How would you pay it?" He thought about that seriously. "Fair market rate for the grazing rights going back to when I took over the operation. That's what's fair." He paused. "What if it goes against you?" "Then I move my fence line and stop arguing," Jennie said, "and probably have to rethink my summer grazing plan." She looked at the fire. "I've been counting on that grass, but I've been counting on it because I thought it was mine, not because I was trying to take something that wasn't." "I know that," Nathan said. The fire crackled. The creek ran. The mountains went from gold to rose to purple in the west. "My father and your father," Jennie said after a while, "spent 20 years being enemies over this creek." "They did." "It seems like a waste." She looked at him sideways. "Of 20 years, I mean. Not of the argument. The argument might have been legitimate, just the enmity." "It was a waste," Nathan agreed. "Though I think they each also found it somewhat satisfying to have an enemy. It simplified things." Jennie laughed, which surprised her. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind, the kind that came up without warning. Nathan Hale looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. the slightly careful, slightly warm look that she thought might be what pleasure looked like on a face that had spent years keeping itself composed. "Your father used to send strongly worded letters," Jennie said. "My father would read them aloud at dinner and then compose strongly worded replies." "My father did the same." Nathan smiled. "I found a whole box of the correspondence when I took over the ranch, both sides written in their best Sunday handwriting, because they took it seriously. Because they both cared enormously about the right thing and were completely certain that they were the one who was right." He looked at the creek. "That's a combination that's very good at producing correspondence and very bad at producing solutions." Jennie looked at him. The firelight was warm on his face, and the evening was quiet around them, and she was aware of how close they were sitting, the creek bank being narrow and the fire being small and neither of them having moved apart. "You're very different from what I expected," she said. "You're different from what I expected too," Nathan said. He held her gaze, steady and honest as everything else about him. Jennie looked back at the fire. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said nothing, because there was nothing she needed to say. Some silences are comfortable because they contain things that do not need to be spoken yet. The survey results arrived on Friday. George Alderman rode out to both properties with copies of his findings, which were clear, and Jennie thought slightly anticlimactic in their clarity, given how much energy had been spent on the question. The actual boundary line, based on the original 1874 survey stakes that Alderman had located using the complete field notes that turned out to be in a second ledger at the county recorder's office that neither Jennie nor Nathan had known existed, ran along the east bank of Sorrow Creek's original 1874 channel. Since the creek had shifted 15 yards east in the intervening 9 years, the legal boundary was 15 yards east of the current water's edge. This meant that the disputed grazing land was split almost exactly down the middle. The northern portion of the disputed strip belonged to Jennie Brenner. The southern portion, where the creek had shifted most significantly, belonged to Nathan Hale. Each of them had been grazing on some of the other's land for years, in roughly equal measure. Alderman presented this finding with the expression of a man who had delivered such news before and knew that the reaction to it was unpredictable. He looked from Jennie to Nathan and back again. Nathan looked at the survey, then he looked at Jennie. Then he said, "Well, that's about what I thought might be the case." "About what I thought too," Jennie said. Alderman seemed to have been expecting something more dramatic. "So you're both agreeable to the findings." "I'll have a new fence line staked by end of the month," Nathan said to Jennie. "And I'll set off a credit for the grazing rights on your northern section, same rate as the grazing district's charge." He paused. "Though if you wanted to settle it differently, I'm open to discussing it." "What kind of differently?" Jennie asked. "There's a water rights question as well," he said. "The creek being where it is now, the actual flow is on my side of the legal boundary. Which means technically you have a water access issue if we fence strictly to the survey line." He looked at Alderman. "That's right, isn't it?" Alderman consulted his notes. "Strictly speaking, yes." Nathan turned back to Jennie. "I'd rather work out a water access agreement than fence you away from the creek, if you're amenable." Jennie looked at him for a long moment, this man who could have simply accepted the favorable water rights position and said nothing about it. "I'm amenable," she said. They paid George Alderman, split exactly as agreed, thanked him for his work, and then were left alone with the survey findings and the question of what came next. Alderman rode away looking mildly puzzled that the whole thing had gone so smoothly. "You could have said nothing about the water access," Jennie said. "I know," Nathan said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her with those direct, dark eyes. "Because it wouldn't have been right," he said, "and because I'd rather have a neighbor I can work with than a half-mile of disputed water rights and another generation of Sunday handwriting." Jennie folded her copy of the survey findings and tucked it into her coat pocket. She looked at Nathan Hale, who was looking at the creek with his hat pushed back on his head and the morning sun full on his face, and she thought that she had ridden out 2 months ago with a map and a grievance, and had found something entirely unexpected, which was a man who argued honestly and made good coffee, and apparently had no particular interest in making things more difficult than they needed to be. It was, she thought, one of the more startling things that had happened to her. "Come to dinner," she said. The words were out the same way they had been with the coffee, before she had fully decided, and this time she did not feel the same impulse to qualify them. "Saturday. Come to dinner. I'm not a bad cook, and I think we have things to discuss about the water access agreement." Nathan Hale looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile and was considerably warmer than a smile. "I'll be there," he said. He came on Saturday with his hat in his hand, and a bottle of what turned out to be a very good rye whiskey from a distillery in Cheyenne, which he presented at the door with the slightly formal manner of a man who has rehearsed a casual gesture, until the rehearsal shows just slightly. Jennie accepted it and brought him inside, and Cord materialized from somewhere in the back of the house and subjected Nathan to 20 minutes of the most pointed conversational interrogation she had ever witnessed, asking about his herd numbers and his water situation and the structural soundness of his bunkhouse with the air of a man who is not remotely asking about those things. Nathan answered every question with patience and transparency, and added details about his operations, finances that Cord had not asked for, but that answered what Cord was actually trying to find out. He did it without apparent self-consciousness, as if he understood exactly what the interrogation was about and was entirely willing to submit to it. When Cord finally retreated to wherever Cord retreated to on evenings when he had accomplished his purpose, Nathan looked at Jennie across the table with a faint, warm expression. "He loves you," he said. "I mean that respectfully. He raised me more than my father did in the practical sense," Jennie said. "My father was better at the grand vision of things than the day-to-day." She set a plate of beans and roasted pork and cornbread on the table between them. "Cord taught me to rope and ride and shoot and to read a cattle market and to mend fence and to argue with the bank. Sounds like a better education than most," Nathan said. "It was." She sat down across from him. "I had a mother until I was 12. After she died, the ranch was all there was." Nathan looked at her carefully. "I'm sorry," he said. "It was a long time ago." But she found herself talking about her mother anyway, in a way she rarely did, because Nathan Hale had the quality of making it easy to say things that usually stayed put inside. He listened and asked one or two careful questions, and did not try to resolve anything or offer anything beyond his attention, which was exactly what that kind of conversation needed. He told her about Pennsylvania, about his father's small farm and his own reasons for coming west, which had been partly opportunity and partly the particular restlessness that the West pulled out of a certain kind of man. He told her about the first winter on the Hale homestead, which had been genuinely terrible, and about Pete, the young man from the creek, who was his only current ranch hand and was good-natured and willing but green as spring grass. "You need more hands," Jennie said. "I know. It's been hard to find good men who want to stay on in the county. Most of the cowhand traffic is moving south toward the larger operations." "I've had the same problem," she said. "Cord and Elijah are loyal, but they're not getting younger. I tried to hire on in the spring and couldn't find anyone who wanted to stay on for fair wages when the big outfits are paying more for trail driving." Nathan looked at his plate. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man about to say something that he has considered carefully. "There might be advantages," he said, "to the Brenner operation and the Hale operation working some things in common. The fence line between us, the water access, the trail to the summer grazing. If we were pulling in the same direction on some of those, it would save both operations resources." Jennie met his eyes. "You're talking about cooperation between the properties." "I'm talking about the possibility of it," he said steadily. "If it suited you." She looked at her plate. "It might suit me," she said. She looked up. "It might suit me very well." After dinner, they sat on the porch in the long Wyoming twilight, which lasted until nearly 9 in the summer, and drank a small measure of the rye whiskey and watched the evening star appear above the mountains. And Nathan Hale did not reach for her hand or say anything that could be called romantic. But he sat close enough that she was aware of his warmth beside her and the deliberate patience of him. And when he finally stood to go, he looked at her on the porch with the same expression she had been collecting over the past months, the one that was careful and warm and completely honest. "Thank you for dinner," he said. "Thank you for the whiskey," she said. "I'll ride out Tuesday," he said, "to discuss the fence-line stakes." "I'll have coffee on," she said. He rode away in the dusk, and Jennie Brenner stood on her porch and felt the warm evening air and looked at the first stars and admitted to herself, quietly and with no particular drama, that she was falling in love with Nathan Hale, and that it was the least convenient and most interesting thing that had happened to her in years. The summer moved the way Wyoming summers do, fast and bright, burning with heat in July, and dropping back to cool nights that smelled of pine and distance. The sky a shade of blue that had no name in any Eastern vocabulary. Nathan rode to the Brenner Ranch on Tuesdays to talk fence lines and water access, and on Thursdays Jennie found reasons to ride toward the Hale property and always ended up at the kitchen table, and the conversations that had started about grazing rights and survey stakes had long since moved into other territory entirely. They talked about books. Nathan Hale had a collection of them that surprised her, a shelf along the north wall of the main room, well-worn volumes of history and natural science and fiction, with margin notes in his close, careful handwriting. He had opinions about them that were thought out and unexpected, and he wanted to know her opinions, not to agree with them, but to think about them alongside his own. And she found herself more articulate about what she thought when she was talking to him than she had ever been when thinking alone. One Tuesday in late June, when they were riding the new fence line to check that the stakes had been set correctly, Nathan's horse picked up a stone in his left forefoot and went lame at the far south end of the property, 3 miles from either ranch house. Nathan dismounted, found the stone, got it out, and assessed the horse with the careful, attentive manner he brought to everything, and determined that the animal needed to walk home slowly. "You can take my mare," Jennie said. "I'm not taking your horse," Nathan said. "Then we walk." He looked at her. She was already dismounting. He said nothing more, and they led both horses the 3 miles back toward the Brenner Ranch in the afternoon sun, and talked the whole way. And it took 2.5 hours, and Jennie thought afterward that she would not have shortened it by 10 minutes if she could have. When they reached the Brenner Ranch, Nathan watered his horse and pronounced him sound enough to ride home slowly, and they stood in the yard in the late afternoon with their horses between them and the light warm and golden, and Nathan said, "Jennie," in a voice that was different from the way he usually said her name, slightly lower, slightly less composed, and she looked at him. He stood with his hat in his hand and his dark eyes steady on her face. "I should tell you," he said, "that I am not good at this kind of thing, saying what I mean about certain things. I am generally more comfortable with surveyor's field notes." "I've noticed," Jennie said, and her voice was not quite steady either. "I think you know what I want to say," he said. "I think I do. I would rather say it plainly and be certain you know." He looked at her directly. "I love you, Jennie. That's what I want to say. I love you, and I would very much like to know if there is any chance you feel something similar." Jennie Brenner looked at Nathan Hale, this man who had been honest with her from the first morning, who had surveyed his own boundary rather than bluster, who had told her about the water rights when he could have said nothing, who listened to her as if her words had weight, who made exceptional coffee and had opinions about books, and had walked 3 miles in the afternoon heat without a word of complaint because she had not wanted to leave her horse. "There is an excellent chance," she said. "There is actually a certainty." Nathan Hale's face changed entirely. It was not a dramatic change. He was not a dramatic man, but the careful composure that he usually wore like a coat relaxed, and underneath it was something luminous and almost young. And he took one step toward her and she took one step toward him, and he kissed her in the dusty ranch yard with their horses watching and the mountains enormous and blue in the west. And it was a gentle, certain, unhurried kiss. The kind that comes from two people who have already done the work of knowing each other and are not in any hurry to rush the rest. When they broke apart, Jennie laughed because she was happy, and it came out of her like something that had been waiting there for months. Nathan looked at her laugh with a kind of reverence. "I should tell you," Jennie said when she could speak again, "that this has been the most complicated and satisfying boundary dispute of my entire life." "Mine too," Nathan said, "by a considerable margin." What followed was the most beautiful summer of Jennie Brenner's life, though she would have been cautious about saying so to anyone who asked, because she was a practical woman and did not trust things that came too easily. But the summer did not come easily. It came with work, as everything in Wyoming did, and the work was part of what made it beautiful. They combined their operations for the summer drive to the high pasture, which gave them enough hands to manage properly for the first time in years. Cord and Elijah from the Brenner side and Pete from the Hale side, and Nathan and Jennie riding the drive together in the early mornings, while the light came gold over the eastern ridges, and the cattle moved as a dark, bovine river up the valley toward the mountain grass. Cord, who had spent 40 years developing an almost supernatural sense for what was happening around him, said nothing about any of it. He simply, at some point in July, began including Nathan Hale in his daily plans as a matter of course, the same way he included the weather and the fence lines in the price of grain. Elijah, who was older and more given to comment, said to Jennie one morning at the end of July, while they were watching Nathan and Pete repair a section of fence on the far meadow, "Your father would have taken a long time to come around to this." "Probably," Jennie agreed. "He'd have come around eventually, though," Elijah said. "He wasn't a stupid man, just a stubborn one." He looked at the meadow. "That man works as hard as anyone I've seen." "He does," Jennie said, "and he's fair to Pete." A man who's fair to someone young and green when he doesn't have to be, that tells you something. "It does," Jennie said. Elijah went back to what he was doing with the air of a man who has said what he came to say. In early August, there was trouble with a band of men who had been running cattle off operations throughout the county, an organized rustling operation that had cost 3 ranches significant losses since spring. The Laramie County Sheriff, a methodical man named Dutton, had been building a case for months, and in the first week of August he rode out to both the Brenner and Hale properties to ask if they had seen anything. They had. Both operations had lost some cattle in June, small numbers, easy to miss in the general count, but present when they compared tallies. Jennie had noted 2 missing steers but attributed it to natural loss. Nathan had noted similar discrepancies and had quietly begun keeping closer track. Sheriff Dutton was interested in Nathan's records, which were detailed and cross-referenced with dates and location notes. He spent an afternoon at the Hale Ranch going over the tallies, and Nathan gave him everything he had without hesitation, and 3 weeks later the rustling operation was caught. A group of 4 men with a temporary camp in a canyon 20 miles north, with cattle from 4 different operations including Brenner and Hale. The cattle were returned, or credited at market value where they had already been sold on. Nathan, at no point during the recovery process, suggested to Jennie that she should have caught the losses sooner or managed her counting better. He simply helped her compile her loss record for the sheriff's accounting and left it at that. Jennie, who had been half-braced for some version of told you so that never came, found this so characteristic of him that it made her feel something fierce and specific in her chest. September came with the first cold mornings and the aspens going yellow in the creek bottoms, and the cattle came down from the summer range, and the ranches began the work of preparing for the long winter. Nathan and Jennie's combined drive brought the herds down together, and the separation of Brenner cattle from Hale cattle at the valley's end was so well organized that it took half the time it would have taken working separately. That evening, as the last of the light went off the mountains, Nathan rode to the Brenner ranch and sat with Jennie on the porch. They had not yet talked, in any explicit way, about what they were to each other or what they might become. They had kissed in the ranch yard in June and a dozen times since, in the way of two people who are sure of each other but not yet sure of what to do with that surety. They had been, in all the practical aspects of their lives, behaving as partners without naming it. Nathan sat beside her on the porch steps and she leaned against him in the cold evening air, and he put his arm around her naturally and they sat looking at the first stars and the dark shapes of the mountains. "I want to ask you something," Nathan said, "and I want you to say what you actually think, not what seems simplest." "I'll try," Jennie said. He was quiet for a moment. "Would you marry me?" he said. "I'm asking because I love you, and because I want to build the rest of my life alongside yours. Not because of the ranches or the boundary line or the water access agreement, though I'm aware those things are also relevant. But those aren't why I'm asking." Jennie sat very still for a moment. She had thought about this, in the quiet of sleepless nights and in the middle of daytime work when her mind wandered where it chose. She had thought about what it would mean, the practical complications and the personal ones, and she had thought about her father's long, solitary management of this land and her own 14 months of it, and she had thought about what it meant to be a woman whose name was on a deed in 1883 Wyoming and what marriage meant in legal terms, because it was not a small thing. She had thought about all of that, and she had also thought, more simply, about what it felt like to sit next to Nathan Hale. "I have to tell you something first," she said. "All right. If I marry, I want to keep this land under the Brenner name, or at least shared. The deed has my father's name and then mine, and I will not simply sign it over." She looked at him. "That might matter to some men." "It doesn't matter to me," Nathan said without a pause. "Your land is your land. That was established by a surveyor and is now documented at the county recorder's office." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." The word fell between them in the cold, clear air, and Nathan Hale pulled her closer and she felt him exhale slowly, as if he had been holding that breath for some time. They sat on the porch steps in the Wyoming dark and did not say anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying, and the silence was full of everything it needed to contain. Cord found out the next morning when Nathan was still at the breakfast table, which was, Jennie thought, probably the most efficient way to handle it. Cord looked at Nathan for a long moment and then looked at Jennie and then back at Nathan. "You'll treat her fair," Cord said. It was not a question. "I will," Nathan said, "and you'll keep her name on that deed." "Already discussed," Nathan said. Cord picked up his coffee cup and drank from it and said, "Good then." He went back outside. Which was, from Cord, approximately the equivalent of a long, emotional speech. Elijah shook Nathan's hand and then shook Jennie's hand and said, "Your father would have come around," which was the most complimentary thing he was going to manage, and they both understood it that way. Pete, who was 20 and given to simple enthusiasm, said, "That's wonderful, that's just wonderful," about 6 times. They married in Laramie in October, in the small Episcopal church on First Street, on a bright cold day with the aspens all stripped of their leaves and the mountains white with first snow. It was a small ceremony, Cord and Elijah and Pete, and the neighboring Garfield family who had been friends to the Brenners since before Jennie was born, and Sheriff Dutton, who turned up because he had developed a genuine liking for Nathan during the rustling case, and the Reverend Miles, who did not make the ceremony longer than it needed to be, which Jennie appreciated. Nathan wore his best coat and had shaved with evident care, and looked at Jennie throughout the ceremony with an expression of such complete, unhurried happiness that she had to look away once, because it was almost too much to hold. She wore her mother's blue wool dress, taken in and let out in various places over the years until it fit her, and her father's small gold watch pinned at her collar. They said their vows in the clear, quiet way they said everything, without embellishment but with great care. And when it was done, and the Reverend Miles announced them married, and Nathan kissed her in front of the small assembled company, Cord made a sound in the back of his throat that was approximately the sound a man makes who will not admit he is moved. The wedding supper was at the hotel dining room, the best one in Laramie, and there was beef and potatoes and apple pie and the rye whiskey from the Cheyenne distillery. And Cord told a story about Thomas Brenner that made everyone laugh and made Jennie feel her father's presence in the room as a warm rather than a mournful thing, which was exactly right. They rode home to the Hale ranch that night under a sky so full of stars it seemed to Jennie barely to need the moon, though the moon was there too, 3/4 full and very bright above the peaks. They rode side by side on the familiar plateau road, and Nathan reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, which he held for the last mile home, and said nothing, because nothing was needed. The first winter of their marriage was the thing that proved it real, because a Wyoming winter does not care about sentiment or new beginnings. It arrived in November with conviction and did not ease until April, and the work of keeping 2 ranch operations running through deep snow and brutal cold, and the constant attrition of livestock management was relentless in the way that work on a ranch in 1883 Wyoming was always relentless. They had made the practical decision, after some discussion, to winter the combined herd at the Hale property, which had better shelter for the cattle on its north range, and to manage the Brenner property with Cord and Elijah running the daily operations while Jennie and Nathan coordinated between both places. This meant Jennie was frequently on horseback between the 2 properties even in bad weather, which Nathan found difficult to be casual about, and she found necessary. They argued about it once in December, when she came in from a ride to check the Brenner fence line in weather that had no business being ridden in, and Nathan was waiting in the yard with his jaw set and his eyes tight. "The fence will wait," he said. "The fence will not wait if it goes down in this cold and we lose cattle through it," she said. They stood in the snow and looked at each other. "I'll ride with you next time," he said. "Yes," she said. "That would be better." He helped her with her horse and they went inside without another word, and the argument was finished because they were both practical people who understood that reasonable position had been reached. That was the shape of their disagreements, not many and not long, because neither of them was the kind of person who argued for the pleasure of it, and they were both constitutionally inclined to find the most sensible solution and implement it. That winter they read aloud to each other in the evenings, taking turns with the books from Nathan's shelf, and played cards with Cord and Elijah and Pete when the dark came down early, and there was nothing else to do, and talked about everything from market prices to natural history to the state of Wyoming politics, and the question of whether the territory would achieve statehood before the decade was out. In January, Nathan found a copy of a scientific journal in a box of materials from the county recorder's office, passed along by aldermen, that contained an article about riparian boundary law and the doctrine of avulsion versus accretion, which was directly relevant to the legal history of their own boundary dispute. He read it with great attention and then read it aloud to Jennie, and they spent an entire evening discussing it. And Jennie thought, looking at her husband across the kitchen table with his glasses on the end of his nose and the journal open between them, that this was one of the particular gifts of having married a man who argued honestly, that the arguments, even old ones, were interesting rather than exhausting. In February, Jennie told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the breakfast table on a Tuesday, simply and directly, because that was how she did most things. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, and then he came around the table and sat beside her and took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression that was so full and so open that it was almost painful to look at, the way looking directly at sunlight is almost painful. "Jennie," he said, just her name. "I know," she said, because she felt it too, that particular enormity of knowing that the world is about to be larger than it was. Cord and Elijah were told at supper that evening, and Cord said, "Good. with such emphasis that it was clear the word was carrying considerably more weight than its single syllable would suggest. Elijah said, "Your mother would have been pleased," which made Jennie press her lips together and nod. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of things without changing the essential nature of them. Jennie continued to ride and work and manage, adjusting as necessary, because she had not gotten through 14 months alone and one boundary dispute and one Wyoming winter by being fragile, and she was not going to begin now. Nathan managed his concern for her by being present, by riding with her wherever she went that the terrain was uncertain, by taking on the tasks that were genuinely inadvisable without being asked, and without making a production of it. Spring came, as Wyoming spring always does, suddenly and gloriously, the snow retreating in days from the lower pastures and the creek running full, and the first green appearing on the south-facing slopes like something the earth could not help doing. The new fence line between Brenner and Hale Range was repaired where the winter had pushed it and marked with the new stones aldermen had recommended, and the Brenner-Hale cattle, which was how everyone had begun referring to the combined herd, went to summer pasture in May with Pete, and a new hand Nathan had hired in March, a serious young man named Tomás from New Mexico who had come north following the cattle market and proven himself immediately competent. Tomás looked at the combined operation, at the two ranch houses and the shared fence line and the water access agreement and the way things were organized, and said to Jennie one morning when she was checking the summer drive preparations, "This is a good arrangement, this." He said it with the thoughtful respect of someone who had seen enough bad arrangements to know what a good one looked like. "It works," Jennie agreed. "More than works," Tomás said. "It makes sense." In June, Jennie and Nathan spent an evening on the bank of Sorrow Creek, which was running quieter in the summer. The snowmelt passed, the current calm and clear. They sat in the same place they had sat the evening of the survey, and Nathan built a small fire and boiled coffee in the same tin pot, and the mountains were the same mountains and the creek was the same creek, and everything was entirely different. "Do you remember the morning you rode out here?" Nathan said. "That first morning." "With murderous intentions," Jennie said. "You were very determined. You were very calm about it, which was extremely annoying." Nathan smiled. He handed her coffee across the fire. "I was not calm," he said. "I had been dreading that conversation for 3 weeks. I was just determined not to show it." Jennie looked at him. "You were dreading it." "You were going to ride out eventually, I knew that. The whole question was whether we were going to be at each other's throats about it, or whether we could talk sensibly." He looked at the fire. "I had gone to the county recorder's office precisely because I wanted to know the truth before you arrived, so that whatever we said to each other would be based on what was actually true rather than what we each wanted to believe." "You had already decided to be honest before I arrived," Jennie said slowly. "I had already decided that the honest approach was the only one that was going to serve either of us well," he said. "Yes." He glanced at her. "I did not anticipate what else would come of it." "What did you think of me?" Jennie said. "That first morning." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were the most capable woman I had ever seen," he said. "Standing on my creek bank with your documents in order and your argument prepared and not a trace of apology for any of it." He looked at the fire. "I thought, this is going to be an interesting conversation. And then I thought other things that I kept rather strictly to myself for a considerable period of time." Jennie laughed softly. "I thought you were the most infuriating man I had ever encountered," she said, "because you kept saying things that were true that I hadn't wanted to be true. And now." She looked at him across the small fire, this man she had married, this man she had come to dispute a boundary with and had found instead a partner in everything. "Now," she said, "I think you are still infuriating, but for entirely different reasons." Nathan reached across the fire and took her hand gently with the particular care he always showed her that was not delicacy but attentiveness. "I love you," he said. "I mean it more each time I say it." "I know," Jennie said. "I feel the same." The baby arrived in September of 1884, on a clear morning that smelled of pine and approaching autumn, attended by Dr. Harlan from Laramie, who had ridden out the day before when it became apparent the time was close. It was a hard labor, honest and determined like everything Jennie did, and it lasted the better part of a day and a night. And Nathan sat in the kitchen through all of it and wore a path in the pine floor, and drank an enormous amount of coffee, and was gentled back to the kitchen repeatedly by Cord, who had seen births before and knew that the most useful thing a man could do in that room was stay out of it. At dawn, Dr. Harlan came to the kitchen door and said, "Healthy boy, Mr. Hale, your wife is well." Nathan went very still for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you," in a voice that was not quite steady, and went through to meet his son. They named him Thomas, for Jennie's father, with Nathan's middle name as a second, and Thomas Jennings Hale arrived in the world with a great deal of dark hair and strong opinions about when he wished to be fed, which was always immediately. Jennie, pale and exhausted and radiant in a way that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the particular light that comes with having done something enormous, held her son and looked at Nathan across the bundle of him, and Nathan's expression was the most open and unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Hello, Thomas," Jennie said, and the baby squinted at her as if considering whether to be impressed. Cord came in to see the child, removed his hat, looked at the baby for a long moment and said, "He looks like your father, Jennie." He replaced his hat. "That's a compliment," he clarified, and left. The years that followed were the building years, the years that accumulate into a life in the way that single stones accumulate into a wall, each one unremarkable in itself, and the structure remarkable only from a distance. Thomas grew from a squinting, opinionated infant into a sturdy, curious boy who had his mother's stubbornness and his father's patience, and the particular quality of children raised on open land, a confidence in physical space that city children never quite develop. In 1886, a daughter arrived, Eleanor, who came easier than Thomas and stayed that way. An easy-tempered child with Jennie's dark red hair and Nathan's directness of gaze, who at 14 months would sit in the kitchen and look at whatever was happening with a calm, judicious attention that made everyone who visited say, she seemed very old for her age. The ranch operations had fully merged by then in all practical terms, though the property remained legally divided as Jennie had insisted, and the Brenner-Hale operation was one of the more efficient in the county. They had by 1886 a herd of decent size, good water, a repaired and properly fenced boundary that no one disputed, 4 good hands including Cord and Tamaz and Pete, and a young woman named Rosa who had come with Tamaz from New Mexico and proved astonishingly good with horses, and the reputation of being the kind of operation that other operators asked questions of. The question of Wyoming statehood, which they had discussed over the kitchen table in the dark of the first winter, came to resolution in 1890, when Wyoming became the 44th state of the Union, notable among other things for having given women the right to vote since its territorial days, which was something Jennie Brenner Hale felt with a particular, uncomplicated pride. She registered to vote in the first state election with Thomas, who was 6 and extremely interested in the proceedings, sitting on the wagon bench beside her, and Nathan riding on the other side, and she cast her ballot with the clean satisfaction of a woman who had spent her life insisting on being treated as a person with standing, and here, at least, the law agreed with her. Nathan voted, and then stood beside her outside the polling station in Laramie and looked at her with an expression she had catalogued by now in the 1,000 small ways she knew him. "Proud of you," he said. "It should have been this way everywhere years ago," she said. "Yes," he agreed entirely simply. "It should have." They drove home through the late afternoon, Thomas asleep against Jennie's side and Eleanor in the wagon bed with Cord, who was telling her a story that she was listening to with her customary judicious attention. The mountains were magnificent in the autumn light, the aspens already gold, the first snow sitting on the highest peaks, The same mountains that had been there the morning Jennie had ridden across the plateau with a map under her arm and an argument prepared. And everything was different and everything was the same. In 1893, a second son arrived, James, who had Nathan's dark hair and Jennie's determination, and who came into the world evidently already with strong opinions about things. He was a loud, cheerful, energetic child who broke 3 things in the house in his first year of walking, and was unable to encounter a fence without trying to climb it, which Jennie found simultaneously exhausting and entirely endearing. Thomas, by now 9 and taking his role as eldest with considerable seriousness, appointed himself James's primary supervisor, which mostly amounted to following his younger brother around and explaining at length why various things were inadvisable, an approach that had no measurable effect whatsoever, but that Thomas pursued with great conviction. Eleanor, 7, watched both brothers with her father's calm dark eyes and her mother's slightly wry awareness of the world, and occasionally issued a quiet correction that actually worked, which she did without drama or gloating, which was characteristic of her. Nathan Hale, watching his children from the porch one September evening in 1893, said to Jennie, who was sitting beside him, "Do you ever think about that morning, the creek bank?" "I think about it fairly often," Jennie said. "It was an important morning." "It was the most important morning of my life," Nathan said. "Other than the morning each of them was born, and the morning we were married." He paused. "That's several important mornings." "You had good coffee that day," Jennie said. Nathan looked at her with an expression that was 11 years of marriage and still the same quality of warmth underneath the composure. "The coffee was very good that day," he agreed. "I didn't say so at the time. I didn't want to give you an advantage." "I know," he said. "I knew it then too. I could see it in your face." His eyes were amused and entirely warm. "I liked you enormously for it. I thought, this is a woman who is not going to give ground without reason, and who is going to be very sure before she says anything she's not certain of." Jennie looked at her children in the yard, Thomas explaining something with great earnestness to James, who was ignoring him with magnificent completeness, Eleanor watching a hawk move over the south pasture with quiet attention. The mountains were there beyond them, permanent and enormous, the same mountains under the same sky, the creek running in the valley below, the fence line clear and properly marked along the east bank of Sorrow Creek's original 1874 channel, as documented by George Alderman and recorded at the county courthouse and no longer disputed by anyone. "I rode out that morning because I was afraid," Jennie said. She had not said this before. "Not afraid of you, afraid that I would lose the land, that I wouldn't be able to hold it, that everything my father built would just slowly get taken from me because I was a woman running an operation alone and there wasn't anyone who was going to make things fair just for the sake of fairness." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I know that was the real reason," he said. It was obvious to anyone paying attention. He looked at the yard, at their children. "The land wasn't being taken from you, but I understood why it felt that way. The whole system, the law, the property arrangements, none of it was designed with a woman like you in mind. And you had to fight for everything anyway." He paused. "I hope I have not added to what you've had to fight." "You have never added to what I've had to fight," Jennie said. "You have been one of the very few things that made it easier." Nathan reached over and took her hand, the same way he had taken her hand on the ride home from the wedding, simply and naturally, as if there were nothing else to do with his hand when hers was near it. They sat on the porch in the evening air, hand in hand, watching James successfully climb the fence and Thomas's expression of principled outrage at this development, and Eleanor's quiet observation of both, and the mountains going from gold to rose in the west, and the sky doing the enormous Wyoming things it did with light and distance, and the creek visible as a silver line in the valley below, Sorrow Creek, which had caused so much trouble and had ultimately been the reason for all of this. Cord was sitting on the bunkhouse steps in the distance, smoking his pipe, a figure as permanent to this landscape as the fence posts and the barn roof, aged now and moving more carefully but present, always present, as if he had grown from the Brenner soil along with the grass. Tamaz and Rosa had their own small cabin on the property and their own children, 2 of them, and Rosa had that spring begun training horses for other operations in the area, which was bringing in additional income, and which she was extraordinarily good at. Pete had married a woman from Laramie and had a place of his own now, but still helped out in the busy seasons, and came for supper on Sundays with his family. The operation had grown to something more than either the Brenner Ranch or the Hale Ranch had been separately, not because of scale or ambition, but because it was run by 2 people who approached every problem with honesty and worked alongside each other rather than across from each other. People in the county knew this, and it was reflected in the way they were spoken of, not as the Hale Ranch or the Brenner Ranch, but as the Brenner-Hale Place, which was shorthand for an operation you could trust to deal straight with you. That fall, a young man arrived at the gate of the Brenner-Hale property looking for work. He was perhaps 19, road-dusted and clear-eyed, carrying himself with the particular combination of pride and uncertainty that characterized young men on their own for the first time. His name was Will Tucker, and he had come from Kansas, following the cattle drives north and looking to settle somewhere decent. Nathan talked to him at the gate for 20 minutes, asking about his experience with cattle and horses and fence work, and what he understood about water management in dry seasons. Will Tucker answered everything directly, said he did not know some things and was willing to learn, and did not oversell himself. Nathan looked at Jennie, who had come to stand in the yard while the conversation was happening. She gave him a small nod. "You can try for the season," Nathan told Will Tucker. "We'll see how it goes." Will Tucker became, over the next 2 years, one of the best hands the operation had ever seen, with a particular gift for cattle management that Cord said was something you were either born with or you weren't, and that Will Tucker had been born with it. By the time he was 21, he was managing the summer drive with a confidence that had taken Nathan 10 years to develop himself. In 1895, Nathan rode the full length of the shared boundary line alone for the first time in years, from the northern stake to the southern end, checking the fence, checking the creek, checking the water access points that the 1883 agreement had established. It was a clear October day, the kind Wyoming produced in autumn as if in apology for the winters, the light gold and exact and the air so clean it felt like breathing something that had never been breathed before. He rode the line slowly, stopping at the flat rock where he and Jennie had first spread the field notes and the survey maps, where she had sat across from him with her documents and her arguments and her careful, watchful eyes. The cottonwood above the rock was larger now, its trunk thicker, its roots more established along the bank. The creek ran clear. He sat his horse and looked at the water for a long time. What he had done that morning, 12 years ago, the morning she had come with her map and her grievance, had been simply to tell the truth. To say he did not know the answer rather than bluster, to acknowledge the complexity rather than exploit it, to offer coffee and the county records rather than a fight. It had not seemed like anything significant at the time. It had seemed like the only sensible approach, but the truth was that it had not been easy. He had been standing in the creek in the cold of that May morning, and he had heard the hooves on the shale bank, and he had looked up and seen her. And the first thing he had thought, before the question of boundaries and maps and field notes, was that she was the most arresting person he had seen in Wyoming, standing on his creek bank with the early sun on her hair and her face set with absolute resolution. He had made the decision in the space of those first seconds to be entirely honest with her, and it had not been because honesty was easy in that moment, but because he had understood at some level below conscious thought that anything less than honesty would forfeit something he was not willing to forfeit. He had not known, then, what that something was. He had found out in the months that followed. He turned his horse back toward home and rode across the plateau in the late afternoon light, and the Brenner Hale Ranch came into view on its gentle rise with the barn and the bunkhouse and the kitchen garden and the smoke from the stove pipe and the wagon in the yard. And on the porch, a small figure that resolved as he came closer into a leaner, 9 years old and apparently very interested in the hawk that was circling over the south pasture, watching it with the focused, patient attention that she had brought to everything since she was 14 months old. Thomas came around the corner of the barn at a run, saw his father coming and changed course to intercept him at the gate, which he opened with the practiced ease of a child who had been helping with gates since he could reach the latch. "Mama wants to know if you'll be back for supper," he said. "Tell her yes," Nathan said, dismounting. "Were the fences all right?" "All right," Nathan confirmed. Thomas closed the gate with proprietary satisfaction and ran back toward the house to deliver the message. And Nathan led his horse to the barn and unsaddled him and gave him water and hay, all the ordinary motions of ordinary life, and felt the deep, encompassing warmth of a man who has built what he meant to build and is living in the building of it. Jennie was at the kitchen stove when he came in, and the room smelled of coffee and supper and the particular smell of the pine floor and the old wood of the walls that was the smell of home, and she looked up when he came through the door and said, "Well, how's the fence?" "Good," he said. "All good." She looked at him for a moment longer than the answer required, reading him the way she had learned to read him, the way she read weather off the mountains. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He hung his coat on the hook by the door and went to pour coffee from the pot on the stove and brought her a cup as well, setting it beside her on the work table. "I was thinking about the morning you rode out to the creek," he said. 12 years ago." Jennie wrapped her hands around the cup. "You went all the way to the creek and back and thought about something from 12 years ago." "I thought about a number of things," he said, "but mostly that." She looked at him with the warm, clear look that was specific to the way she looked at him, the look that had taken years to develop and that he found, if anything, more significant than when it had first appeared. "And what did you think about it?" she said. "That I am glad you came," he said. "That I am glad for the argument and the coffee and the county records and all of it." He looked at her across the kitchen, which smelled of supper and their life together. "That I am very glad you rode out that morning." Jennie Brenner Hale smiled at her husband across the kitchen of their shared home, with the mountains behind the window and the creek in the valley below, and the children's voices coming through the walls from wherever they were, and the whole apparatus of their built and continuing life present in the room around them. "So am I," she said. "Though I do want to be clear that if the survey had come out differently, I would have fought you for every acre." "I know," Nathan said, and smiled, which still, 12 years on, had that quality of warmth coming through the composure, the same quality she had catalogued that first morning on the creek bank without knowing what she was cataloging. "The coffee did help," Jennie admitted. "I know that too," he said. "I could tell even then that you approved of the coffee." "I didn't say anything about the coffee that morning." "No," Nathan agreed. "But your face said it. You wrapped both hands around the cup the way a person does when they're really glad to have it." He came around the table to her, and she turned to face him, and he put his hands on either side of her face in the way he had, gentle and certain, and looked at her directly the way he always had from that first morning. "I thought, if she comes back tomorrow, I will make better coffee than this." Jennie laughed, the real laugh, the one that came up without warning, the one he had been collecting since the evening by the creek fire. "That's a ridiculous thought to have had." "And yet here you are," Nathan said. "Here I am," Jennie said. He kissed her in the kitchen with the coffee on the stove, and outside Thomas was explaining something at length to James, and Alina was watching her hawk, and Cord was on the bunkhouse steps with his pipe. And the mountains stood where they had always stood above the valley of Sorrow Creek, which had moved and shifted and caused 20 years of trouble, and was now simply the water that ran through the land they had made together, of their separate inheritances of stubbornness and honesty, and the Wyoming earth. The fence line stood clear and properly documented and no longer disputed. The coffee was excellent, as it always was. The kitchen was warm against the October cold. The children would come in for supper soon. Everything was resolved and solid and good, and the stars would be out by 7, enormous over the plateau, and Jennie Brenner had ridden out one May morning with a rolled map and a grievance, and had found, against all reasonable expectation, that the man she had come to argue with was the man she had been looking for without knowing she was looking, and the argument had been worth having, and the creek had given them more than it had ever taken away. And the whole long story of the boundary dispute, and the survey and the field notes and the honest argument and the very good coffee had added up, in the end, to this kitchen and this man and these children and this life, in this country under this sky, which was all the sky there was, and which was more than enough. Nathan Hale made coffee every morning without fail, and it was always excellent, and Jennie Brenner drank it every morning beside him, and she never stopped being grateful for it, which was not a small thing to be grateful for, and was also not only about the coffee, and Nathan knew this, and Jennie knew that he knew, and the knowing of it between them was one of the quiet constants of a life built on honest ground.